Hey folks, welcome to this Geometry Nodes tutorial. In this one we're going to be creating this kind of side-scrolling infinite loop landscape with an aeroplane flying through it. It's all pretty procedural and we can just change stuff around as we want. It's inspired by this piece over here that I was sent on Twitter a couple of weeks ago. Check them out, link in the description. Let's jump into this. Okay, I've got a fresh file here. I'm working in Blender 3.2, but 3.1 should be just fine for this as well. 3.1 is the most recent, and 3.0 should be okay. We're basically just using raycasts. There is one point you'll need the flip faces node, so just be aware of that for later. That's for our inverse hull effect, so not technically necessary, just a stylistic decision. Let's begin here with adding a cube. It doesn't matter what you add, we're going to delete it. Just something to contain our geometry nodes. In this lesson, we're going to be learning about looping noise, giving us seamless noise, as well as giving us proper control with raycasts. So that's our main two things. Start off by adding a mesh primitive cube, and we'll just have a click on this. Shift Alt left click. It's going to give you the preview. And if you're interested in getting these little timing readouts, these are available in your node editor overlays from 3.1 and above. We are going to need a little bit more geometry to work with. We're only going to be needing it in the X and the Y. The Z can stay at 2 here, just to give us enough to sort of displace the top face. So go ahead and set your X and Y to either 50 or 100. I'm going to start off with a 50 and turn it up later. Once you've added a set position node, we're going to use this for our actual displacement. So grab the offset here, we can pull this off and type in, we need to combine XYZ. So go ahead and add that. We're only interested really in the Z axis here, and we're just going to drag this off and put in a noise texture straight away. Looking good so far. Now we need to limit this to just the top faces. Easiest way for us to limit stuff by normal direction is with the input normal node. We're going to be dragging this off and giving ourselves a dot product, which is on the vector math node. And we're comparing this against 0, 0, 1. So dot product basically allows you to output a value between -1 and 1 when dealing with normalized vectors, where -1 will be two vectors which are opposite direction. +1 will be two vectors which are exactly in the same direction, and a gradient in between those. So in this case we have a cube with a top face which is pointing directly upwards, so 0, 0, 1, and all of the other faces are pointing in different directions. So we can use a dot product against 0, 0, 1. This is basically now going to allow us to compare this for where this is greater than some value, and we just plug this into our selection on the set position. Now you can see we're only displacing that top surface. Make sure you're keeping stuff organized. So we're just going to call this frame top selection. So right now this is moved up loads, which means we need to first of all sort out our mid-level and our strength. Noise textures are by default between 0 and 1. The higher your detail and roughness, actually the closer that average will be to 0.5, or like the closest the bias will be to 0.5. Just something to be aware of there. So we need to subtract 0.5 with a utility math node, subtract 0.5, and now we can multiply this. So duplicate that along, set this to multiply, and now you have strength, and you can see that sort of centered. There's no net movement for our positions. Let's pull these off with values. I just like to kind of segregate stuff a little bit. So I'm going to call this one mid-level, and I'm going to call this other one strength. Set these back. So 0.5 for mid-level and strength to whatever you want. If we wanted this to loop endlessly, we're going to need to have a little bit of a think about how we map our noise texture. So let me show you why this is important. If we just plug in a position on here and we use the vector math node, and let's maybe plug in a combine XYZ on here and just plug the scene time into the X. Okay, so this is moving along nicely, but as soon as we get to the end of our timeline, there we go, it's just had a little jump. I'm going to make this a shorter loop. We're going to go with 100 frames, just so we can see that loop a little bit better. And you can see it's jumping. So doing it this way is not what we want to do. We want to make sure that everything is properly sort of mapped onto a round. Every time you think about stuff looping or being circular, being round or curved, sine and cos, just generally trigonometry is going to be what you're looking for. And it's no different here. So what we need to do is basically remap our noise texture to a looping coordinate space. So let's do this. We'll do this over a couple of steps just so we can see what's going on. So I'll get rid of those actually. And what I'm going to do first of all, I've got my position node. I'm going to use a vector math set to scale. This is going to be my overall scale control here. And I'm actually going to set my noise texture down a little bit lower. So I'm just going to set this up around 10 for now. This will give us a good preview of what's happening. I'm going to go for a higher resolution cube as well. This is completely up to you. 150 just to make it a bit smoother there. And I'm also going to turn the detail down. Okay, so the noise looks like noise. That's good. Let's now separate XYZ. And we're also going to recombine those XYZs. And let's just see what happens if we plug a sine and cos onto our X and Y. So this would be kind of our first stop at having a look at how we can do this. Sine and cos, X and Y. All right, so it is actually tiling. You can see that we have repeating elements in here now. However, it's quite obvious that this is going in one direction and then it's going back, right? And that's because sine and cos waves do that. That's what they do. So we have to do this a little bit more intelligently. And luckily, we have 4D noise. So this is going to allow us to do this properly. Now, sine and cos, this is the right thinking, but it's just a little bit more complex here. So I'm going to do Control-Shift-D to duplicate that sine, and we're going to go sine and cos from our X. And we're also going to do let's just duplicate these down, sine and cos from our Y. It's important to note that this method, even though we're using 4D noise, we will actually have a two-dimensional texture, because we're only using the X and the Y from our input. So just something to be aware of. Now, if I plug these in like this, right? So sine cos from X go into X and Y, sine from Y goes into the Z. Now we've got something which loops, but it's obviously still kind of coming one way and then the other. So this final cosine can go into our W. This is the final one of our axes. And you can see now that we actually have a texture, which let's increase the scale at the start here. This texture is properly looping, but it doesn't really look like it's got some horrible like phase restarting. So this is basically how we can set up a properly looping noise. Great. So now what we need to do is work out how to animate this. If we want to move this in one direction over there, we're going to need to add something to the X or the Y, right? In this instance, I'm going to do this adding to the X-axis so that we're scrolling sort of in this direction. Now, instead of plugging this into one of our sort of final X-axes over here, we need to do this before we set up our looping stuff. So it's going to happen way back here. Now, another thing we want to make sure that we're doing is we're actually doing it before this scale. So we can set our scale to tau, T-A-U, 2 pi is what that gives you, 6.283. And 6.283 is exactly one wavelength of sine and cosine, which means on a cube, which is 1 meter square, you have 1 meter, which is now mapped to 2 pi, which means that you're getting a full sine wave along that axis. So this is like one tile. If I was to duplicate this in the x-axis, move it along by 1, you can see that that perfectly aligns. If I duplicate that, then you can see that we're getting that proper tiling. So one tile now for our thing. We will want to control this a little bit more finely later when we start looking at the speed, but just to begin with, that's to be aware of, right? 2 pi, that's important. Now we need to go ahead and add, so vector math, a vector. So drag this off, set this to combine X, Y, Z, and we're going to be moving this in the X-axis. There you go. What we need, remember this is being scaled up to 2 pi afterwards. So at this point, all we're thinking about is whole units. We want this loop to basically move this whole thing by a factor of 1, by 1 unit across. That makes our math nice and easy because we can just grab an input scene time node. I know that I've set my end frames down here to be 100, so 100 frames. So if I just go ahead and divide this frame output here by 100, and I plug this into my x-axis, now I know that over 100 frames, we're going to get this to move across exactly 1 loop. You can see we're not getting any jumping or anything. That's perfect. So then this is actually moving pretty slow. If you want to change the scale of this, don't change the scale here. This is controlling our wavelength, you can change the scale on your noise texture. So come across here, you can now change this however you want. Set your detail however you want, whatever. I might set mine to like 4, just to give me some sort of land mass looking stuff. Might reduce my strength a bit. Looks pretty cool, but I kind of want this to be bigger and moving faster. Or at least that's the illusion that I want to give it. And the best way for us to do this is simply to multiply our time down here. Right, so let's add another multiply in here. So if I set this, make sure you don't have it set to 100. This is basically doing exactly a loop every frame. So you can see now I can set my scale a little bit faster on here. And that's looking pretty good. Maybe I want to make this a little bit smaller though, right? And maybe I want my tile size to actually be kind of bigger than our cube here. So let's just add a couple of controls, right? I'm going to add a few value nodes. I'm actually going to add 2. So we've got one for our end frames, or our total frames, which I know is 100. I just like to pull stuff off so that I can see that it's definitely sort of a control. And then I'm going to have my speed control, and let's set this one to 2. But at the same time, I'm going to use this to divide our 2pi. So I can come down here, plug this into the bottom, set this to divide. So now what we're doing is we're dividing tau by our speed. So now you can see the front and back of our tile are no longer like identical, which I just think looks a bit better. However, the faster we make our speed, I actually want it to make our scale on the noise a little bit higher. So I'm going to use another multiply here. So Control Shift D, set this multiply. Going to plug this up into the scale of the noise. And we're just going to add another control on here, another one of these, which I will change to land scale. And now we have a handy dandy control for this. There we go, looking pretty neat. Might slow it down a little bit. Okay, so now we have a little bit of a faster scrolling speed, but it's still looping. It's still doing like our perfect 100 frame loop. Perfect. I can control my mid-level and my strength however I want. Maybe I make it a little bit lower actually. So there we go. We've learned how to loop noise. We've learned how to make a side scroller, which is perfectly our frame length. If you wanted to pause and take a screenshot of the nodes, here they are. The next part of this tutorial is going to be us basically building a system that will allow us to sort of fly through the valley. And it's important that the aeroplane looks like it's tracking kind of a lower ground. I don't want it to jump around too much, but I do want it to do 2 things. I want it to go left to right, and I want it to not hit the ground. So if it gets too close to the ground, I want it to move up. To do this, we can use raycasts. So it's actually a fairly logically straightforward process, but if you've not done it before, raycasting can be a little bit of a tricky process. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and add a geometry raycast node. And I'm going to use this as our target. We're going to be shooting rays at the ground, right? That's the important thing. We're going to be shooting it from a point above the ground. Now, this is something to be aware of with raycasting. If I have something like, let's use just a default cube mesh here. So I've got my cube. I'm going to make it nice and small, maybe a little bit shallower in the Z height here, maybe a little bit wider. We're going to add banking later as well, so I'm making sure that we have a kind of a shape for this. Now, if we do a raycast using the cube, what it's going to do is every single one of its vertices is going to shoot a ray off at whatever the target geometry is. In fact, there's a node in my toolkit if you want to visualize this a little bit better. The raycast node, plug this in. I will just plug this in like that. All right. The reason I'm just using my version is just so that I can demonstrate this. Maybe we can just transform these up as well. Okay, so each one of these vertices, you can see, is being shot off in the direction that we've given it, the ray direction, and it is hitting this surface. And then the sort of the rebound arrows, this is coming off at the normal direction of the surface, right? So you can see each one of these points is going to be hitting the surface. Now, for our steering control, for the moving left and right, it's really important that as we go over the top of a bump, the left wing doesn't go left while the right wing goes right, because we're going to just stretch our aeroplane and it's going to look really dumb. So what we actually want to do is we want to have this come from a single source position, right? So if we have this and we come off with a vector, now you can see with my Raycast Plus, this is actually not ideal because it still looks like it's coming off these points. But what's actually happening is it's coming from this position. That preview's kind of misleading there. So it's actually coming from, well, actually in this case, it's coming from 0, 0, so right about here, going straight down. Right, so instead of using the vertices of our cube, if we plug something into the source position, we can make sure that we're using a fixed point. That's very important because it allows us to not break our aeroplane in half. So what we're going to be doing, let me just plug in, I'm going to need a set position node. Actually, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start here, right? So we've got our cube and I'm going to, actually, I will use a set position node. So I'm going to grab a geometry set position just in here like so. And what I want to make sure that I'm doing is I am using the offset vector here. So combine XYZ, plug into that. And this is going to do all of our left, right, up and down controls. When it comes to banking, we will plug that into our position. So that's going to be different. I'm also going to make sure I'm joining this in here. Okay, cool. So we can see our ground. We can see our aeroplane currently flying through the ground. So not ideal. To begin with, I'm going to make sure that my vector here is moving our aeroplane. So we can just plug in a vector math node from our vector. And now I can move this up however I want to do it. There we go, something like that. There we go, that's probably fine. I just want to make sure I'm not actually going beneath the ground at any point. That's probably still okay. All right, so we've got our source position plugged in. So this means that all of our rays will come from this exact vector, which is what our cube, our sort of aeroplane proxy, is now centered on. Shooting the array length of 100 meters, that's plenty. We're only actually going like maybe 0.5 here. That's fine, it doesn't really matter. And we're not dealing with attributes. We're not dealing with really any of these things, the hit position, hit normal, or the attribute. We're only interested in the distance. And what we're actually going to be doing here, let me make this cube narrow in the Y, no, narrow in the X axis, there we go. So now what we have is a little slice of cube, like so, and this is just going to help us visualize what's going on. I'm going to shoot my ray not straight down, I'm going to shoot it slightly off to the side. Not quite 45 degrees, because I think sometimes that might miss. We're just going to go somewhere around here. And we're going to do another raycast in the opposite direction like that. So what this is going to let us do is if one of these is longer than the other, we can basically take the difference between them and we can shift the aeroplane in that direction. So what this is going to basically allow us to do is if the land comes up really high on one side, or like this is in the middle, if it comes up really close on one side and farther on the other, then it's going to move the aeroplane into a clear area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do Control-Shift-D on this raycast. So they're just the same raycasts. And I'm going to make one go to the, I can see this is my green axis. So Y-axis, we're going to go minus 0.5 and the other one is going to go to positive 0.5. So we're shooting off at those two slanting angles. What we can now do is measure the difference between them. So we're going to need a math node set to subtract coming off the hit distance, something like this, and we'll plug this into here. And I also want to halve this. I don't want it to be the full amount. In fact, I might even go like less than half, but this gives us a control for how much is being offset. Now this is shooting in one direction, clearly going like closer to the high land. I'm going to switch my subtract around and now it's trying to avoid stuff. This is not like a true Pathfinder experience, unfortunately. It will struggle. Well, it will fail if it goes beneath the surface, which is why I was quite precise about that. So if I go down lower, you can see we're not moving anymore because we're casting at the bottom and they'll be both in the same direction. So I'll come up to the top here and that should be about fine there. Still feels like it's kind of moving away from stuff. It's a large part of the challenge. Now we just need to make sure that we've got ground clearance. So it'll like come up if it gets too close to the ground. Easy way to do that. Again, we're going to be raycasting. So let's add another raycast. Coming off our original set position here. So looking at the ground. This time our source position is going to be not this original vector. We need the original vector adding to the left and right vector that we've just added here. So we've already got this addition that we're using to position the cube in the first place. So this is what we're using now for our source position. So now all these rays are going to be wherever the aeroplane is, translated sideways. This time we are shooting straight down, and we're interested in what happens when the ground gets too close. Okay, so we need to think of this as a bit of an if statement. If we're dealing with this just as kind of common sense here, we basically say, like, if you fly too close to the ground, go up. That's what we're doing here. So if we fly too close to the ground, if the hit distance is below a certain limit that we can set, so we can basically plug this into a compare when it is less than some value. And I'm going to make sure I pull this off as well, just so I can remember it's here. Value, which I'm going to rename to clearance. So if the hit distance is less than, let's say 0.1, yes, this is all quite small, so 0.1, then do something, right? So we're going to plug this into a switch, and I will set this to float, plugging into the toggle there. So if true, then we need to basically add something to the Z height, and that something is going to be based on how far away we are from the ground. If I plug in my hit distance straight away, and I need to make sure this is being added to the Z axis. So let's combine X, Y, Z, plug this into the Z, plug this into another add node. So now what happens is we get close and then we kind of come down. So why is this happening? In fact, if I hide this switch, so it's just continuously following this, and I'm also going to put this back to being a full tile so we can actually understand what's going on. As I move this around, you can see as the ground falls away, our aeroplane goes up. So why is this? It's because we are adding the hit distance to the Z height. So when we're very close to hitting, that distance is very low. In fact, when we hit, it's 0. And it's basically saying, if you hit the ground, definitely hit the ground. When we're a long way from the ground, go a long way up. So this is kind of not what we want. What we actually want to have happen, so we've got this threshold, which I'm going to turn back on there. I can unmute that. And we're going to find some land. There we go. What we want to do is we actually want to sort of invert this. Right now, we're coming along in a straight line, and then we're going straight to this high point, following that land, and then we're going back to just following straight. Right, and this height here, this is our clearance threshold. So if we were to subtract this height from our distance threshold, then let's say this is 0.1, our clearance threshold is 0.1, so 0.1 minus 0.1, that's 0. So now this would say 0 here. And then where this is a little bit lower, you've got 0.1 minus some amount, let's say this is 0.05, then you would have it coming up basically. So that's actually the behavior we want. We want to invert this with a math node, utilities, math, plug this on here, change it to subtract. Make sure that you are putting your clearance into the top socket, hit distance into the bottom. And now you can see, as we get too close to the ground, we're going up. So that's exactly what we want there. It's all moving a little bit quick at the moment. I might set this to maybe 0.15. It's all still going pretty well. Amazing. Right. It's all kind of zigging and zagging a lot. Don't worry about that. We'll fix that in a moment as well. Smooth it out. I'm going to frame this up. So this is going to be our altitude. And this first one is going to be our steering. We haven't actually got our tilting done yet. So tilting is our next part, and it's really easy to set up, but we need to think about what we're doing here. We do not have a method to get like the previous frame's information. We can't like hold it on one frame and then when we go to the next frame loop, we can call that information back. What we can do, however, is we can use a vector which is positioned behind our aeroplane. Right, so right now we have this perfectly centered vector and it's casting at the ground and it's giving us this kind of steering left and right. If we take the same idea, the raycasts, but we position that vector slightly behind, now we're going to know whether or not we're moving left or right from where we would have done just before. So this is kind of like using a time dimension, right? Because when we're having a side scroller like this, the scrolling axis and the time axis are the same. It doesn't matter which one you're talking about, we can use them interchangeably. So that allows us to use spatial positions to control this. Let's take a raycast, we're going to need both of these, and we don't need to know all of this information. We don't need to know how much it's gone to side. We just need to know the difference between them. So I'm going to duplicate these 3, so the 2 raycasts and the subtract. I do Control-Shift-D, Alt-P to move it out of that frame. And I'm going to move it slightly back from our vector, which I'm going to do with a vector math. Set to add is actually fine. And I'm just going to move it back, so minus 0.05, something like that. Something small. Don't want to go too far because otherwise we're going to get errors, because obviously the ground over here is quite significantly different to the ground just here. So we just want to know a little bit behind. This is pretty good. We want to just know the difference now. So another subtract. I'm going to subtract between both of these. And we can use this with a multiply. We're already going like positive and negative, right? So if we're steering to the right, then we can say that this will have like a positive value. And if we're steering to the left, we're going to have a negative value, right? So now we can just basically use a multiply to set the sort of the amplitude of this. And then we can just use that to bank the plane, use a vector rotate. And that vector rotate is going to go onto the position. So we're using both the position and the offset socket here. So grab your position, going to give us a rotate, and I'm going to plug the position into that original vector. There we go. My axis is going to be the x-axis. This is the one that we're flying along here. So you can see if I move this to the left or to the right, then we're just basically tumbling our aeroplane as we come around. And we just want this to be controlled by this. So there we go. Now if I look at this straight on, you can see it's moving a little bit. It's a little bit jumpy, a little bit more strength. It's coming left and right really, really quickly. And this is because of the detail of our noise displacement. That's something which is a little bit problematic, because if we want to see like quite a high resolution noise like this, something kind of interesting, but we don't want to raycast that, then we're actually going to need to sort of separate this out. So if I just bring these in like this, okay, so these are all of my ones that I'm raycasting, all the ones that I'm using to position my aeroplane. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my set position all the way back to this noise texture, Control-Shift-D. I'm going to move these down, and I'm going to plug the bottom ones into here, and I can just dissolve that reroute. Okay. So now what's happening is we have 2 fields, and this allows me to basically set the detail on this one to 0. And now you can see, so we're jumping now because we're technically going below the surface. If you were to view this one, let's do this. Then because we no longer have that roughness, there you go, you can see there, we're just hitting the surface, and that's going in. So I will just move this up a little bit. Alternatively, let's have a look at how we can actually change the sort of noise seed, because we no longer have access to the seed, right? The W on our noise texture, that's now gone. We don't really necessarily want to change this cosine. We could add something in here, but nice easy way, because we already have it exposed. We have the Y on here, so we can just move this sideways, and we can try a different space to be in. Really what you're looking for is one that has like a good gully. So it feels really like it's sort of in the hills. I think this one's pretty good. I'm going to move this down as far as I can as well. If you want to see the whole thing at once as well, you can just make your original cube longer in the X direction. There we go. So now what I can do, if I find my vector, so this one is our original position, let's just move this down as low as we can. It's going to give us a nice little sort of sunk in that valley. And I'll set this back to 1 now. So now it really feels like it's coming through this valley. And the ground's nice and smooth. We've got rid of all of that detail. So we're also no longer having to deal with stuff sort of jumping side to side. So I'm going to plug in my original one that I want to see. Looks a little bit more like ground. Let's set up a little bit of a visual. Have a nice little render, and you can set this up however you want. We're just going to be jumping into shaders and setting up a simple kind of contour setup. And yeah, actually before that, let's add in an aeroplane. I'm just going to use one that I modeled before. Basically, whatever you want for your aeroplane just replaces this cube. I'm going to just grab in the craft, and for me, that just looked something like this, sort of angular. I made it with meta balls and then just decimated and mirrored it. So something super simple, at least for the rendering style we're going to use here. The simpler, the better. Just to keep it nice and hidden, I'm going to put it in a new collection. I'm going to disable it. Okay, back to my cube tile. I'm going to get rid of this cube. I'm going to grab a input object info, which I'm going to set to my craft. Geometry in. This is huge. So we're also going to stick on a geometry transform node. Is this going the right way? No, it's going backwards. So we're going to rotate it 180 degrees in the z-axis, and we're going to scale it down so it fits in our landscape. I might set this even lower, 0.1, so we get some really close passes. Now, one thing that is going to allow us to get our rendering style looking cool is an inverse hull. If you've done inverse hull before, you've probably done it with a solidify modifier and then flipped the faces. That does not work with this because it's not really going to let you set a material offset in a way which is convenient. So we're just going to do it in geometry nodes. So just at the end here, we've got our join geometry. And I'm going to make sure that I have included now another set position. I'm going to be controlling this with the normal. See, that's just blown up massively, which is fine. That's what we want. But we just want to scale this down. So let's grab a vector math node, which I will set to scale. Bring this down nice and small. 0.01, something like that. And we want to flip these faces. Grab a mesh flip faces node. And I just want to join this onto the original one. And then I also want to assign a material, which I'm going to do right at the end. I'm going to do everything in one material. So let's make another node workspace. Shader editor. I'm going to set a new one in here. And I'm also going to set the renderer to Eevee. Because we're doing an animation in here, I'm also going to turn off viewport denoising. This option here. If I come back into here, and you can see if I change this viewport denoising to on, any details on the surface get lost really quickly, just because it's sort of doing a noise dithered denoise. What we need is, let's go into rendered view. We're going to need to turn our noise, our world strength to 0, so everything goes black. And then let's start off. I'm going to get rid of this principal BSTF, that doesn't matter. We have no lights. We're just going to do everything straight into the surface there. So let's grab a wave texture. We're going to grab a Z-axis wave texture. So this is pretty good. However, right now this is using the generated coordinates by default, which means that if this changes size in the Z-axis, it's going to change the scale of your wave texture. So let's plug this. If we just type in position, it's going to give us the geometry node position. It's fine with it set to sign. I'm going to use a math node. So converter math, set this to greater than. Now we've got some contours, not perfect contours. You'll see whenever we're on the top of something, the line width gets much thicker. Unfortunate, but we're going for kind of a cheap shader here, so that's fine. Now I also want to make sure that I don't have any of this on the sides, and a nice easy way for us to do that, exactly the same way as we made our top selection in geometry nodes. We're going to use our normal in the shader. We are going to be using a vector math node, which is under converters this time. Set to dot product 001. Have a look at the output of that. Now we have the top faces, and we can just use a math node set to greater than, and we can just reduce that until it kind of catches all of these top faces. Okay, top selection done. And if we look at this, we have contours which are white, and the rest of this is black. We have a top face which is white, and the rest of this is black. So the maths that we want to use here is multiply. So another math node set to multiply. And there we go. So 0 times anything is always going to be 0. So that's why black always wins with multiply. But it means that we get our contours on the top looking good. All right. Next thing we want to do is we want to sort out our inverse hull. So to do this, what we actually need to do is bring across some masks from our node tree. This is actually really easy. All you need to do is grab an attribute, capture attribute. And what we're going to do is we're going to capture a 1 where we want this mask. So that's all I'm doing. Basically saying this inverse hull stuff. So let me frame that up so we can remember it's here. Our inverse hull now has a value of 1. We can plug this directly into our group output. So I'm going to make sure I rename this in my group node to hull. And on my output attributes, on my geometry nodes modifier, let's set this one as well to be called hull. And now in our shader, let's add an input attribute, which we're going to again set to hull. Just set this to factor, and everything's gone white. So what we need to do as well is we need to make sure that we are backface culling. So in your shader options, press N, go down to the options tab, just tick on backface cull. Shadow mode, we can turn to none. blend mode. We're not doing anything with transparency, so I'm just going to leave that as is. If you want to change the thickness of your hull, it's on this scale node. Kind of want this pretty low, I think 0.005 maybe. A bit more of a sort of hairline. I don't know, already looking pretty neat. I quite like it. All right, we're going to finish it, setting up the shader, and I'm going to show you how to set up an orthographic camera real easy, like an isometric camera. So the next thing I want to do here, I've got these, and I want to basically apply them to the top face. Everything else is going to be black. So let's use a color mix RGB. We're going to put black in the 0. We're going to get ourselves a color for color 2. And this color is going to be based off window coordinates. So this basically means from left to right in our viewport is 0 to 1, right? Anywhere within sort of the region that your camera can see, this is your window coordinate space. Ultimately, we're going to be rendering this with a camera. So it will just change to using the actual camera rather than the viewport, but it's fine for now. So input texture coordinate, come down here, we need our window. There we go, and you can see bottom left is 0, 0. And that's controlling it like that. I like to do this because it makes it screen space rather than basically, I want it to ignore the mesh. I want it to look kind of like graphic designy. Next thing we want to do here is separate this. So convert it, separate X, Y, Z, and just take the X axis, which we're going to put through a mix RGB. And we're going to go just from blue to red. Something like that is fine. Come back to our mix. Plug this on here. There we go. That's looking pretty neat. Now I want to do the same for my hull. And I want to make sure the hull is at the end. So grab another mix shader. Sorry, mix RGB. I'm going to plug the FAC into here. Now you can see we've got our hull. You can set this to a different color if you want, but I think it looks pretty cool all the same. And then the final thing I want to do is I want to color the airplane. It's getting kind of lost. So again, we just need to bring in another one of these capture attribute masks. Got our aeroplane. There we go. There it is. Just this set position. So I'm going to make sure I have my capture attribute on here. Going to that join geometry. Set my value to 1. And I'm just going to plug this in. Attribute to a new socket. Rename this one to plane. Give it a name in here. And again, we're going to use another attribute. Now, inverse hull wants to happen right at the end. Let's make sure we're viewing everything. Here we go. The hull wants to happen right at the end. Just because we want the hull also around the aeroplane. We just want to sort of fill in this color in here. So I will just go ahead and add another mix node in between. Add another attribute. Call this one plane. Plug my factor into the mix there. And there we go. Now we can color the plane whatever color we want. You could make this sort of holography. You could do something cool with, well, you can do whatever you want. The shader stuff is kind of a bonus, so go wild. Let's set up a camera, super quick. I'm going to shift A, we're going to add a camera object. And what I want to do is on my right hand side here, we can see I've got my object properties open, the orange square. I'm going to set my location to -2, -2. So we're just back here, basically where we can see. And then I'm going to go up 2 as well. All right, so now we're sort of perfectly 2 by 2 by 2 away from the origin. This is obviously centered on the origin. And then I also want to add an object constraint where I'm going to track to the cube. There we go. So now I'm looking straight at the cube. Isometric does not have perspective. So set this to orthographic, and you can reduce your orthographic scale until you have something that fits nicely in your view. Use the Shift Y and X if you want to move this, and there we go. That was fun. All right, that's how you can loop noise. That's how you can use raycasts, and how you can set up a very simple little contour shader. Not perfect contours, but pretty good. Hope you've had fun. Hope you've learned something, and I'll catch you in the next one.